CSS floats, and I'm not talking about root beer floats here, folks. This is something that's a lot less pleasant. CSS floats are for beginner web designers and web developers. They can be the bane of their existence. CSS floats are a pain in the butt, to say the least. However, they don't have to be. It's one of the more difficult concepts to grasp and to get right, because there are a lot of different factors that come into play, and there are a lot of bugs that can really throw you off, and it can be quite confusing to explain or to work around those. But I'm going to do my best right now to clear it all up, remove the fog of war, so to speak, and show you how floats work and how clear works. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, that's okay, because I'm going to start from the very top. What are CSS floats? Well, CSS floats are kind of the web's way of letting you achieve kind of a magazine layout, where you have an image that is floated to the right side of the content while the content wraps around the left side, or an image floated to the left and the text is flowing along the right side, or say over here, this image is floated to the right and the text flows along the side. These images, when you're creating a magazine layout, you just place the image wherever you want, and that's okay. And you could do it in a Word editor like Microsoft Word or Apple Pages, and you could just align the image left or right or center, and that will let the content flow around either side. On the web, we use what's called a CSS float to achieve that. So we can learn this as I'm talking about it. Create the file floats.html and go ahead and put that basic layout, add CSS floats as the title, make sure stylesheet.css is hooked up, give the body the idea of floats, and then if you want to follow along as I'm doing this, you're free to. If you want to wait, watch the video and then start over again, that's cool too. Add the div with the idea of container, and then a level 1 heading, CSS floats. And then we have 2 paragraph tags with very large paragraphs of lorem ipsum within each paragraph. Now in the CSS, I just have a section down here called CSS floats, and I'm targeting the body ID of floats, giving the background that kind of red color. And then I'm targeting floats and container, and I'm giving it the background of white and padding of 20 pixels. That's what you need to do to get up to speed. I'll let you do that. You could pause the video and do what you need to do. And you can also reference the final code that I provided in the course files at the very beginning of this section. Otherwise, I'm going to assume you're ready to go. Okay, I'm going to start off here and I'm going to throw an image right here above the paragraph tag. Now, if you're wondering, this is a split view in brackets. It lets you split the screen so you can look at 2 files at once. And I just thought I would do that for efficiency purposes. We have my floats.html and style sheet, just for heads up. Anyway, image. I want to throw in an image there of me, of course. There I am. Now, this behaves as you would think, because images are kind of funny. They're they're technically an inline block element. I believe in the past lecture, I said that images were inline, but in fact they are inline block because they take up a whole line, and they don't span the full width, but they break it on a new line. So images kind of are a hybrid element. And so this behaves as you would expect. We have the image and then the text below. But what if you want that text to float or to flow up beside the image on the right side here? Well, all you really got to do, I'm just going to give this image an ID. I'm going to say Brad1. And I'm just going to target it down here, Brad1. And watch this, float left. There we go. So now the content has floated up to the right side. Well, the image is floated left, which allows the content to flow up beside the image here. And then if you wanted to space that out, all you really had to do is just give a bit of margin on either side. So 20 pixels on the right and 10 pixels on the bottom. And there you go. And then 0 on the left. And there you go. Looks beautiful. Now, if I wanted to bring it to the right side, I just got to change that to the right, float right. And I'm going to change that margin to say 0 on top, 0 on the right, 20 on bottom, or 10 on the bottom, 20 on the left. You don't want to have margin on the same side as where you're floating, because then you're going to have a weird extra gap where you don't want that. You want that sitting nicely on either side, like so. Okay, so we've covered float left and right with one single image or div. This could be a div instead of an image. I could just give a div here and just say ID box 1, and let's style that, and I'll show you. Box 1. I'm going to say width 200 pixels, height 200 pixels, background red. Whoops. And I'm just going to remove this image here just so you can see. And I will float this right. There you go. So it works with that as well. If you wanted to just do a div, it doesn't have to be an image. It could be a div or any other element for that matter. Okay, so I'm just going to throw that image back there, and I'm going to hide that box. I just see how I just wrapped that in a comment. I just wrapped it in a comment just to hide that element for now. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to show you something. You can also use floats, not only just to float your images left and right and just to have your content flow, because you can see how that can be beneficial. You can also use floats to achieve a layout, and that's primarily how you achieve, in fact, really the only way you achieve layouts, multi-column layouts in your CSS. You have websites that have left content and a sidebar, or left sidebar and right content, or multiple columns, such as in Bootstrap and responsive frameworks like that. You have multiple columns. You use floats to do that. Now let me just show you. I'm going to remove these things here, this content, the image and the box, and I'm going to wrap the paragraph tag, each paragraph tag, in a separate div. And I'm going to give this the ID of left column. So this is the left column. Or no, let's call it main column. That's a bit more semantic. And I'll use camel case there, main column. And on this one, I'll give it the ID of sidebar. Okay. Now I'm just going to tab that in. There we go. So obviously, these are just block level elements, so they're just going to flow just down in the page there, fully across the width. They're not going to just magically create a layout by giving it an ID. This is simply so you could target it in CSS. So what we can do here is we can create a sidebar and a main column layout using floats, and you'll be pretty excited to see how this works. Now, keep in mind, you need to be able to give the elements a width in order to float them. Because if they are full width and you float, it's not going to do anything. You need to have a set width in order to give space to float content either left or right. So I'm going to say main column. Well, I'm working with, in this container here, I set it up here somewhere, 600 pixels. And so that basically means we have from here, because we can't count the padding for a space to float, because we have 20 pixels on either side, like I said, giving us 600 pixels in the middle here to work with. So we need to be able to make sure that these elements can fit within that space. So main column, I'm going to give it about, I'm going to say 2/3 of that width. And so I can use any sort of unit of measurement. I can use pixels or percent. Percent's quite easy because you could say 66% and 33% on the other side. But I'm going to work with pixels right now, just to keep it simple. So if I'm working with 600, let's say I want 400. It's going to be width of 400 pixels. Let's even do 350 pixels. And let's give the width of the sidebar, let's give it a width of, well, what do we have left? We have 250 pixels. So now, if I float the main column left, and I float the sidebar right, I will get the layout. However, we have a couple issues here. I do see this weird, the box just kind of collapsed, and that's exactly what happened. This box, the white container, collapsed because it doesn't know how to measure the height of the floats of these columns. It doesn't magically understand the height. It's actually how it behaves. This is normal behavior. Unfortunate, but it's very easy to fix. Now, for one, I want to be able to give some space between this column and this column. I need to be able to have some padding, or a gutter is what it's called, in between each of these. So I'm actually going to take off about, let's say 40 pixels. Let's say 30 pixels. There we go. So we have 30 pixel gutter in between the main content and the sidebar, like so. And so there are a few ways of dealing with this collapsed content. And unfortunately, some of them are worse than others, and some of them are a little hacky. But let me just show you a couple of the main ones here. So we need to be able to clear the container from these floats. We need to be able to get it back to its normal layout. A lot of what people do is add a div here, and they kind of give it the class of clear. And then in their CSS, you select that clear class, and then you would just say clear both. And there we go. We have our container back. And that's one way of doing it. Unfortunately, this simple method doesn't always work for on all browsers, but it's pretty good. But the problem with this is it's not semantic. It's just a div that's just sitting there with no content. Even though we are using a class here, it's not, we're not putting inline styles here. We're still, it's an empty div element, and it's pointless. There's no meaning, there's no content. It's just simply there to improve the layout. There is a better way. And what you can do is I'm going to remove this div altogether. And so that should give us our poor layout again. And the container, I'm going to give it a class. And it's common to call it the clear fix. You can also call it clear. It really doesn't matter, but clear fix is the common convention on the web. And I am going to select the clear fix class down here. And in fact, I'm going to use a pseudo class, which is called after, or a pseudo element. And this creates an invisible element after the container. You can't see it, and it's simply there to help. It's kind of a CSS trick that lets you do certain things like this. And so it's not adding content. There's no empty div here, but it is selecting an invisible element immediately after this container. And then what you do is you use the content property, and you use two quotation marks. This just means there's no content, empty content. And then you say display table, and then clear both. That will fix your CSS collapse, the collapse of the container. So now, anytime you're using an element, say you have somewhere down in your page here, you add another couple floats, left and right floats, and you get that collapse, just add the clear fix class to the element that is collapsed, and it will uncollapse it. It will fix it for you. Now let me just show you, since we just kind of covered the floats and the collapse there, that's the biggest part of floats. I'm going to show you a couple other ways that you can use your floats. So I'm just going to add another div here. I'm going to show you something. This is another problem that you'll see after floats. So we did fix the collapse issue, but there is still a problem with the layout after the floats. Let me just show you. Okay, so I have a div here, and I'm going to give it the ID of footer. Hello, I'm a footer. Okay, so I have my footer here, but what happened? There's something going on here. You can look over here, and because brackets is helpful and puts a blue border to show you the element, why is the element starting up here, spanning the full width, all the way down here, and then ending up here? Shouldn't it be down here and in the bottom of this content? Shouldn't it be right here? It should. But the problem is this content is being adjusted because these elements are floated, and it's trying to flow this content up beside these elements, but because there's no space, it's creating a weird layout issue. So all you have to do is simply clear this element. And so you don't have to use the clear fix. You can, but it's not necessary in this case. All you need to do is select the footer, in our case, and clear, because we're floating left and right those elements that are preceding this element. Just clear both, and then that will clear your footer. And so there is your footer. Let me give it a nice background so you can see. There we go. So there's our footer, which has cleared the content. So we have the left content, the sidebar, and the footer. Let me just give some background colors to these elements so you can see a little bit more helpful visual cue. So we have our main column, then we have our sidebar, and then the footer. So you could see how it's floated. We have the content here, sidebar, and the footer. And then now, after the footer, content will flow normally. So I could put an image down here of me, and it will flow normally. Everything's all good. And I can have some content, and everything should work fine and dandy. There we go. Now, if I wanted to, go even more crazy, watch this. I'll give this the ID of Brad1, and now that's floated to the right. Now keep in mind, because that has floated, we might want to keep in mind here that if we didn't want to float this element down here, you could go ahead and I'm gonna clear that paragraph. So I'm gonna just go down to my CSS here and select paragraph 1. And I'm going to clear the right side because that was floated right. I don't need to clear both because I'm only needing to clear the right float. So there you go. And I'm just going to clean it up here just to look a little bit better. I'm going to give some margin on the top. Why not? There we go. And maybe the footer will have a little bit of margin to make this layout look a little bit more presentable. There we go. And the sidebar. So now we have a little bit more presentable of a layout. I know it's a little wonky looking right now, but we have the main content, the sidebar, we have a footer, and then content below the footer, which is a little unconventional, but hey, we're allowed to play around. We have a floated image, and we have some more text that has cleared this image right here. Now, just another note while I have you here, let me just show you something. What if we want to give a little bit of padding to this main content? What happens? Remember how the width is added to when you add padding? So let's add 50 pixels, or 50 pixels of padding on all sides. Look what happens. Now, the sidebar just jumped down and now the layout's broken. Well, that's because this no longer fits the container width. We need to be able to account for that. We just added 100 pixels of width to this entire element. So we need to take off 100 pixels of width here so you can have that padding. And then now we need to play around with the sidebar. Let's give some padding to that sidebar. Let's say padding, let's go 40 pixels. So now we're broken again, but keep in mind, we just added 80 pixels. So we need to take 80 pixels off of here. So 80, we're taking off 80 of here. So we have 140. And there we have our layout again. Now, one other thing is if I were to have less content in the sidebar, you could see we have some nice margin after the sidebar here. But what if the sidebar has less content than the main content? Now we lose that margin because this element, the the main column doesn't have margin on the bottom. So let's fix that. Margin bottom. So now, whether this element is longer than this element or vice versa, like so, we will always have that 20 pixels there and everything should be good. And now I don't like this 20 pixels on top of that image, so I'll just clean that up. I know I put it there initially, but I changed my mind. There we go. And now we have a bit more realistic of a web layout. And now what's cool is because we understand floats, because we're going to play around with them more, and we're going to use them in our upcoming and all the rest of the lectures because they're so common. But I wanted to wait until you were ready, young grasshopper, to understand those CSS floats. So feel free to play around with that. Change the widths, change the gutters, float them left, float them right. Just see what happens. Break some stuff, get confused, and just get your hands dirty, I like to say. And I'll see you in the next lecture.